So it's Lyme Disease Awareness Month, and it's also the 10th anniversary of the premiere of Under Our Skin at the Tribeca Film Festival, which also was in May. Since Under Our Skin came out 10 years ago, in what ways would you say that the landscape of Lyme disease has changed? Um, and in what ways has it not changed?
Well, Under Our Skin was really pivotal in terms of cracking open public awareness about Lyme disease. It played such a phenomenal role in doing that. It started to crack that egg open so that people could see what was going on. And it became not only, did it have its theatrical airings and its television airing, but it also became one of those things where people were taking it to their support groups and gathering people around to watch it. And then they were taking it to their doctors, and then they were taking it to researchers, and then they were taking it to legislators. So it ended up having this really profound effect, and people are still doing that today with it. I've heard of people saying, oh yeah, I gave it to my legislator when I went to visit him. So I think, that's one thing that happened there was that there was this initial understanding that there was a crisis and that it was an important crisis for people to attend to in a way that hadn't been as public before.
Given that there was something in the mainstream that sort of, like you said, cracked things open, what's the most disappointing thing looking back, and maybe what's the most promising as well?
Well, I think the most disappointing thing looking back, and I don't know that it could have been avoided, but one of the most disappointing things looking back is a polarization in the medical community and research community around Lyme disease. Right around the time actually Under Our Skin came out, that was when we had the IDSA hearings. The antitrust investigation was launched against the IDSA. One of the first investigations by an attorney general against a medical society, a very powerful medical society. So that made a really big difference. And it really heightened the scientific understanding that there were real disputes going on scientifically in the community. Today, we have these opportunities that weren't available 10 years ago. We have technological advances. We have the democratization of science. So people don't have to wait for the government to intervene anymore, where, it used to be, let's wait for the government to do the right thing.
What does that mean, the democratization of science, and why is it more pronounced now than it was 10 years ago?
So what the democratization of science is when you take science out of the ivory towers and it goes out to the normal person. So today, 10 years ago, we didn't have the technological tools to do something like launch a patient registry. So we launched My Lyme Data, which is the first national patient registry in Lyme disease, 2 years ago, and we have 10,000 patients enrolled, over 10,000 patients. That's remarkable. We're in the top 5% of patient registries in the nation, and this is a patient-driven effort. So this wasn't, we waited for a scientist to come tap us on our shoulder. We actually were able to just go out and launch this, and we're not the only ones doing it. Other diseases are doing this. So now, and the national government is got a big push behind these patient registries because they fill all of these research gaps. So where you have an area that isn't being attended to by the researchers, by government as much as it should be, patient registries can go in and start collecting data. They can start help recruiting for clinical trials. They can test hypotheses. They can do follow-up. They can do dissemination. They can be partners, really partners in research in a way that they haven't been able to do before. So that's a dramatic shift, and it's not something Lyme brought about. It's just technology got there.
Right. I think one of the things that we were starting to see at the time we were making Under Our Skin was what you're referring to as the democratization of science, or ordinary people creating community and creating impact through that, through joining forces, through the internet, which was a way that patients could link together, could share research, could share their stories, and it was a powerful force,
Mm-hmm.
and it also created more polarization because that's a threat to the patriarchy of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases, it was women,
Mm-hmm.
mothers
That's right.
who were caring for children or their families or themselves, and who were organizing. And um, so I guess my question is, to what extent is this still a polarizing factor, or has it actually been accepted into the discourse that it's not just crazy Lyme patients
Mm-hmm.
who are um, who are creating an activist movement that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have any scientific validity,
Mm-hmm.
but that it is a force that not only needs to be reckoned with because it's not
Mm-hmm.
going away because of technology, but because they have something to say and something to provide.
Yeah, that's a really good question because part of what has happened has been, regardless of Lyme, there is a polarization between academic researchers who've traditionally controlled all of the funding for a disease and uh, patient registries and other novel ways of doing research. But traditionally, research has been done in randomized controlled trials where the funding was very tightly restricted to researchers who had a track record for doing randomized controlled trials. So this thing about gathering information that's generated by patients, that all of that is new. It used to be that you could, if a patient said something, you couldn't trust it, period. But that has sort of shifted in a major way because I think because the government has realized that the traditional research model costs too much, it takes too long, and it doesn't apply to most people. And it takes too long because recruitment takes a long time. It's very costly because of the delays in recruitment and in putting together the trials. So you end up with these studies that don't apply to clinical practice. And that has been occurring across the board. I think that government right now is recognizing that the traditional research model has failed. And we can't continue using that exclusively because we don't have time. We actually have healthcare crises. We can't do a trial and wait 5 years for the results of that, and then do another trial and wait 5 more years for results. If you add those up, the patients you were trying to serve will be dead by the time you come up with
Yeah,
anything close to an answer.
yeah.
So now this recognition that we have these vast amounts of data and they shouldn't be just sitting there unharvested. Let's try something, gather the data from it, see what worked, change our behavior in terms of how we're treating disease, see how that works, and keep upping the ratchet so that we improve clinical care. And you can do that without even having the biological studies. I mean, that's what's so, beautiful about it. So you've got, lots of tools in your research box now that you didn't have before.
Okay, so with that in mind, within the mainstream scientific community, how would you say that Lyme disease is seen now versus 10 years ago? Has that changed at all?
I think it's changed. It's very interesting. If you withhold all funding for research, you just, you can always say, well, there isn't enough evidence. And there isn't enough evidence because we haven't funded the studies, right? But what's happening right now is I see a new group of researchers coming in who are doing really some terrific work. There's this very slow shift going on in terms of understanding what persistence is, how we measure it, how might we get a better handle on it.
Yeah.
People are beginning to see, oh, this is a complicated picture. But that shift in thinking from black and white, it's either this or it's that. It's either persistent or it doesn't exist. That's beginning to shift as people are gathering more information.
Hmm. Would you say that there's any more of a sense of a détente?
If you look at the old guard, of researchers who were initially involved in Lyme disease, I don't think that I've seen a great shift. But what you do see is you see people coming in who are academic researchers who don't hold sort of a rigid viewpoint of reality and who are much more open-minded to taking a look with new tools that you couldn't have even looked at 10 years ago. So you've got a bumper crop of researchers entering the fray, and I think that the funding sources have changed to some extent. You know, it used to be the NIH was the only place you could get funding. And then the NIH cut its funding and cut its funding and cut its funding and cut its funding. And that means that some researchers who were receiving a lot of funding from the NIH they didn't have that stable resource of funds. And patient groups started stepping in and funding research. I think that Lyme disease is getting some of the benefits of that.
Mm-hmm. So what do you tell some Lyme sufferers or Lyme activists, some of whom might think that that's consorting with the devil? There's a lot of skepticism that the Lyme disease community is selling out by working in these institutional ways.
That's interesting. I think that we won't get movement by looking back, and I don't think that the group of researchers who were leading the charge 10 years ago, 20 years ago, are going to be the group of researchers who find change. But I do think that it's important for us to be involved with academic researchers and researchers who aren't academic, right? So both. And I think those tools are becoming available. Patient groups are beginning to put together what's known as a research engine. So it's a very different concept. So you end up with a patient registry that's associated with a biorepository that works with researchers who want to do research that will benefit the Lyme community. And you start pulling together something that allows you to accelerate the pace of research dynamically in real time. And also, the focus is shifting right now to patient-centered research. So patient-centered research, that's been around for a little while, but it's really gaining steam. So all of your legislative efforts right now, the FDA gets its funding. It's got a little provision in it that says it's got to be patient-centered. So now they've got patient-centered drug approval. That's brand new, right? That's come up in the last, I'd say, 8 years. Things are shifting in this dramatic way.
So as someone who's been working in the Lyme trenches for so long, from a scientific, legal, and political perspective, what would you tell someone who's sick today or who just gets sick today, someone maybe who's recently diagnosed? Can you offer them any more hope today than you could have 10 years ago?
Well, the only thing that has shifted in terms of hope for patients who are just being newly diagnosed, I guess there are two things. One is, I think with a growing awareness, more patients are being diagnosed early. Early diagnosis is key. It's really key in terms of getting people well. But the people who are diagnosed late, and in my Lyme data, of the people who are involved in my Lyme data, 70% are not diagnosed until they have late Lyme disease. It's kind of a shocking statistic. That's like at the point where treatment is really very difficult, and finding people who will treat you is very difficult. We have more treating physicians than we ever have. We have more protective legislation than we ever have. But is it enough? No, it's so far short of what needs to happen to correct the access to care problem that exists in Lyme disease. Doctors are still being targeted. Insurance companies are still allowed to go into the medical boards and report somebody who they think is overutilizing services or who's not compliant with the IDSA guidelines. So you still have this atmosphere of oppression, which results in a marginalization of the patients, their treating physicians, the ability to obtain care. It's very difficult. And the academic researchers, some of them, in the Infectious Diseases Society, it's a territorial turf war. They're trying to drive out their competitors with very aggressive tactics with the medical board. And that has created this very urgent access to care issue for patients. So it's a tough time today to be diagnosed with Lyme disease. It's not, you can't say, oh yeah, today it's infinitely better. It's just we're further along in the journey of trying to make it better.
And do you feel like the IDSA still has a large sway in terms of its influence on how Lyme disease is defined, diagnosed, and treated? Or do you think that that's shifted too, along with this democratization of medicine?
Wouldn't it be lovely if the latter were true? I think actually the IDSA is one of the most powerful medical societies in the world. I think they basically govern all care in hospitals. So patients who go to the hospital say they can't get any care. I mean, they have a real stranglehold on a lot of that because they're at the very top of the pyramid in the hospitals. And they're also right in the pocket of the insurance companies, right? So insurance companies love the IDSA guidelines because they say deny care. Deny care means lower costs for insurance companies.
So I want to go back to 10 years ago, or 10 plus years ago, when we were working on the film. That was also a period where the official count went from 30,000 to 300,000 cases a year.
That was 2013.
Yeah, that's true. That was a little later.
And it's made an enormous difference, so it matters. I mean, it made this profound difference because at 30,000 cases, you're a rare disease, who cares? At 300,000 cases, researchers start caring more, funding starts loosening up, and pharma, which hasn't been too terribly interested in Lyme specifically, but pharma starts perking up its ears a bit. So just that change from 30,000 to 300,000 changed public awareness. It changed the way the press reacted to it. It wasn't somebody necessarily making up a disease. They might be making up a disease, but it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't intrinsically. You weren't saying, oh, it's so rare, you couldn't possibly have it. Yeah, it's not rare. It's a common disease. So that makes a really big difference. That was one of the big differences that happened.
And why do you think that happened? Why do you think that official change happened from 30,000 to 300,000 cases?
I think that they just had an awful lot of pressure to go back and make sure that they, imagine underestimating a crisis tenfold and the consequences that has on funding and so forth. I think the public pressure, and some of that public pressure came from under our skin and all of the publicity that started coming out.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. If you look at the legislation, our government, how it works, what's the fourth estate? It's the press. The press is the only aspect that can truly hold government accountable when the government is going off the rails. And, the press really stepped forward in Lyme disease. We have more articles on Lyme disease than we've ever had before. You've got a lot of people really sort of shining a spotlight in a way that they weren't before. And that's how accountability in government happens.
10 years ago, when we were working on the film, it seemed like at that time there was a lot happening.
Yeah.
There was the Attorney General, Blumenthal, who went after the IDSA, and now he's a senator from Connecticut. We had several pretty high-profile cases against physicians for malpractice. What are the big events that are happening right now, if they are? The milestone events, are there any?
Yeah, there are, but they're quieter. The milestone events that are happening right now are these big transformational shifts that are happening in government across the board. So patient-centered, big data, rapid learning systems, and understanding that the whole research system has to change. But the other thing that's happening, I think, much more quietly, is I think that Lyme groups are beginning to work together in ways that they haven't before. It's not a kumbaya moment, so I don't want to give that impression, but it's more like we need to be doing syncopated dancing or swimming. We need to really, tighten our game up so that it's patients as partners, and that has not been hard. Uh, 10 years ago, I think that would have been, what are you talking about? Just give us the data and go away. Um, but that's not what's happening. So there are these really sort of subtle things that are big trends that I think are way outside the IDSA control. They're societal trends. And I think, if to the extent that we can catch that wave, that's where we get the change that we need.
Hmm. All right. Um, Anything else that you think it's important to add?
Well, I think that there's, I'm a person of hope.
Hmm.
So I think that we're sitting on the verge of a lot of research opportunities that are going to be transformative. I think they're going to be patient driven. I think they're going to be research opportunities where we care about what happens for the patients. Is it something that's going to benefit the patients? At 10,000 patients involved in my Lyme data, I'm optimistic. We've got data that nobody's ever collected before. I mean, we know that of people with late Lyme disease, 60% have co-infections. For how many years did we hear that co-infections were actually rare?
Can you say anything about how, if there's people want to get involved with the Lyme data program, is it too late? Can they still do that? How do they do that? Can you assure them that their information remains private?
Uh-huh.
Can you just say just a few things about that?
If anybody is not a member of my Lyme data, go to mylymedata.org and sign up. We take the obligation to respect patient data extremely seriously. That means that we don't sell it. We don't allow it to be used for anything other than the benefit of patients. If there's research to be done, it has to be research that's going to benefit patients. And we vet researchers who use the data, we vet its use, and we require that the data come back to us when the research is done. So we have really extraordinarily rigorous controls on privacy. And the reason we do that is because privacy is a very valid, real concern in the Lyme population, in part because of stigma associated with the disease. So we're very, very careful of that.
Great, that's really good to hear. We had a comment on Facebook the other day. Someone said, "This film is 10 years old. It's irrelevant, and let's just
That's
move
just
on."
shocking to me because it's like it's pivotal. It's been pivotal in everything that's happened. If we didn't have that big push that came from that, it's just I think it's transformed the landscape. So much actually has happened, and you guys were really instrumental in making it happen.